Okay, we're back, and now we are going to talk about how to deploy our application, take it from running on our local computer, and push it out to Heroku, where it can be used on the internet, and anybody can use it. So the first thing that we need is to head on over to Heroku and download the Heroku CLI, the command line interface. And what the Heroku CLI allows you to do is interact with Heroku from the command line and makes it really easy to set up some stuff locally. So the first thing you'll need to do is hop over and do that. So the link is up above. You can also just hit Google for Heroku CLI. Download that for your operating system. Once you do that, open up a command prompt and type Heroku login and enter your Heroku credentials. If you don't have any, then you need to hit the top right corner of Heroku or go to Heroku and create an account. You shouldn't need to have any sort of payment information. You can create a free account at Heroku to create some free applications. So that is first. Make sure that you have Heroku created and installed. Then the next thing you need to do is open up a command prompt. And inside of that command prompt, you need to navigate to your project. In this case, it's on my desktop, it's Node Financial. And once you've navigated to your project, we are going to type Heroku create. And what Heroku create does is it creates our application. It creates an instance of our application on Heroku that can run our application. That doesn't put any of our code up on Heroku, but what it does to allow us to push our code to Heroku is adds a remote. So if we go to get remote, we can look at our list of remotes. And in the past, we've been pushing to Origin, and we'll still continue pushing to Origin because that's our GitHub remote and puts our code up on GitHub so that we can see it. But we've now also added a new remote called Heroku, and we can push our code to that by typing git push Heroku master. And that pushes our code to Heroku so that it will have it. And that takes a little bit. We'll let that run. While it's running, we can talk a little bit about what Heroku does. Heroku gives you free instances to run an application on the web. Now, these are going to be pretty low power, so you're not going to be able to run your large reach website on it. But it does allow you to push your site up there and run some stuff and test it out and get going. And then you can pay them to create applications that are going to be up more. So the first time we do this, you'll notice as it's doing it, it's installing Node modules. That's because Heroku recognizes this is a Node application, and in order to run, we need to install those Node modules. So as soon as you push it up there for the first time, it's going to install all those so that we can run our application. So our application up on Heroku, once it's done there, it's not going to have a database, not yet. So now that that's pushed, you can see the URL here is Pacific Beach 37917. Yours is going to be different. That's okay. Heroku kind of generates those on its own. The first thing we need to do is tell Heroku to give our application some resources, because for now it doesn't have any. So we're going to run Heroku ps:/scale web equals 1. And what that does is gives our application one free resource to run. So now we can type Heroku open, and that will open our application in the browser. So you'll notice opens up to our homepage, welcome to Node Financial. Now if we go to customer, 500 server error, something's not right. Something's not working on our website. And if we open up a new command to troubleshoot things, and this will be very useful if things don't work the way that you expect, you can open up the troubleshooting tools, Heroku logs -- tail. And what this does is open up the end of your logs. And if we scroll through the logs, which is what our application is writing to Heroku, we can see we got a 500 server error, and down here it says could not connect to MySQL. Remember, on our local machine, we set up our database connection to 127.0.0.1 Well, that works fine on our local machine, but that is not how Heroku works. On our local machine, everything's in one place. Our database is running on our same machine. and our application is running on the same machine. When we get out to Heroku, it's more of a distributed application, and the database server is going to be separate from the application server. And so for that to function, we're going to have to tell our application that when it's on Heroku, it needs to point to a different database. Next up, we need to open our application on Heroku. So go to herokuapp.com. And here you'll pull this stuff up. In this case, Pacific Beach 37917 is our application. And I'm going to pop first up over to settings. And in the settings, you could change the name of your application if that's what you want. If you do that, you're going to have to change the get URL and everything. So be careful about doing that. But we're going to look at the config vars. And what config vars is an environment variable on the Heroku server that we can use to change things about our application. We've talked about it a little bit in the past regarding your development and production environments. Well, one way that you can tell sales that you're running in a production environment is to use these config vars. So the first thing that we're going to do is set up a new config var, a new environment variable called node_env. And that is case sensitive. You need to be all caps there. And we are going to call it deploying. Now, don't worry about why we're calling it that yet. We'll get there in just a few minutes. But you're going to create node_env. You're going to call it deploying. And then we're going to add that. The next thing that we need to do is add a database. Because right now, remember, we had an error getting to the database. Well, that's because by default, Heroku applications don't have any database at all. So we're going to pop on over here, and we are actually going to use, I know we used MySQL on the local host. We are going to pop on over here and switch that from MySQL, and on our Heroku application, we're going to use Postgres. And the reason we're going to do that is because it's easier. Heroku integrates seamlessly with Postgres, and if you want to use MySQL, you can. There are two add-ons here, ClearDB and JawsDB, that offer a free tier, but in order to use those, you have to enter credit card information into Heroku, which it shouldn't charge you anything. It won't charge you anything, but you need to have a credit card, and because not everybody has one, we're going to use Postgres instead. So Postgres, we're going to click that Heroku Postgres. It'll pop up with a little pop-up that says this. We're going to use the hobby dev, and we're going to provision that. Now what that does is it adds a database and a free database to our application. If we hop over to settings again and look at config vars, you'll notice we now have a new config var called database URL. And that includes the username, the password, and all of the information that you need to get there, which makes it really, really easy to add the database to our environment. So let's hop over to our application again and open it up. Again, here we've got it open in WebStorm. And we're going to hop over to the terminal, and the first thing we need to do is install a connector for Postgres. Remember, we installed this connector for MySQL. Now we need to do it for Postgres, and that is npm install --save sales postgresql. And we'll let that install. And the npm install -save, remember, saves that to your requirements, to your packages.json, so that when, for example, Heroku starts your application, the first thing it does is checks that package.json to install all the packages that you need. So we're going to do that. Easy peasy. Now that we have the connector for Postgres, we need to add the connection for Postgres. Now let's open up the configs directory, and we're going to go to connections.js. And in connections.js, you'll remember we added Node Financial, which was all fine and dandy. MySQL, our Node Financial MySQL connection using the Sales MySQL adapter, localhost, all that jazz. Now we're going to add a new one, and I'm going to call it Heroku Postgres. And we're going to use the PostgreSQL adapter. And instead of host, user, password, and database, we are going to use that environment variable that is created inside of Heroku. So we can't access it from here. We could if we downloaded all or input all of that information manually. But a better way to do it is to use that environment variable, because then if things change on the production end, we can automatically switch over to whatever other database we're using. So here we're going to access that environment variable under the name of URL, and we're going to call that process.env.database_URL. And that is, we'll add a comment here, automatically set by Heroku, and we'll say it's SSL false because it's not a secured connection between the two databases, or between our application and the database. You can set that up to use SSL if you want to. That is our connection. We have a connection now called Heroku Postgres. Now, if we wanted to change that for everybody and use it in our development environment and in our production environment, the same database, we could go over here to models. And under models, we set connection, node financial MySQL, migrate, alter. That allowed us to make development a whole lot easier and easily update our database and update our schemas and change things as we needed anytime we wanted. And we could change that here to automatically connect to that Heroku Postgres database. But on our local machine, we don't have that database URL. Now we could set that and do all that. But you know what? We're going to use MySQL for our local development and Postgres in production. Not highly recommended in real development, but it works fine for our example. I would recommend using a Postgres development server on your local environment, Postgres in production. But unfortunately, when I first created these videos, I was using MySQL because that was easier for the other production environment that I was using. Now that we're going to Heroku, we're going to use Postgres because that's what they integrate with. Now, if we go up to the config env directory, we were in connections, now we're in env. And you'll notice there's two files there. One is called development, and we could set a specific set of stuff in our development environment. The other is production. And production tells it that if we have that node env environment that we set up, if that is configured to say production, which by default it is in Heroku, and it will be later for us, then use these settings instead of what we had over here in models. So you'll notice one of the things that we're going to overwrite, and we're going to uncomment here, is our connection. The default is some MySQL server, but we are going to change some MySQL server to now point to Heroku Postgres. And then we're going to copy this file and add a new file called deploying. So we're going to copy, and we're going to right click on env and paste. And now it's going to ask us what we want to call it. We're going to call it deploying.js. Now, this hasn't been added to our Git repository yet, but the only other difference and the only reason that we created deploying is so that we could add migrate alter. And what migrate alter allows us to do is have sales automatically generate the database. Now, in a production environment, you don't want to have it automatically generate the database, because if sales automatically generates your database, it could break your database, and it could lose data that you have in your production database. You don't want to do that in a production environment. But this is a brand new production environment, so we want sales to automatically create it for us. So we created this deploying variable, in which we set on Heroku, so that when we push this up there, it's going to say, hey, what's our environment? It's deploying. And then sales will check this deploying.js file to see what it's supposed to do. And it will use that Heroku Postgres connection and migrate alter, automatically setting up our database for us. So now that we've got our environment created and environment variables all set, and we've got the database ready to go, I think we're ready to deploy. So we're going to hop back over to our command prompt, and we're going to push. And we're going to do that by typing git push Heroku master. first, sorry about that, we have to commit our changes. So we'll do that the old-fashioned way. In GitHub for desktop, let's look over the changes. We've added our Heroku Postgres connection. We've added our deploying.js to deploy the application. We've configured the, you know what, we're going to ignore the changes for the production environment right now. And then we're going to, we've changed package.json to allow Postgres SQL. So now we are going to commit that, and we're going to say added production settings. We'll commit to master, and now we can push to Heroku. And this will tell Heroku that to install the new node module, in this case, sales PostgreSQL. And now we can do Heroku open to open our application again. Once the push has happened, it might take a little bit of time before your application is done building, because get push only pushes the code. Then the application has to go through the startup process. So now I can go to customer, and you can see the page loads, meaning we don't have any database errors anymore. And I can go to new to create a new customer. And there we are. So we now have our customer. We can create a stock if we wanted to, go back to our list of customers. And there we go. We've got it deployed. Now that we've got it deployed, we need to do one more thing before we can be done. And that is to change our environment variable back to production. And probably the easiest way, because the default node environment variable is production, is to just delete that node env config variable. Then, next thing, go back to WebStorm and make sure that your production environment is set to Heroku Postgres. And in here, you do not want that migrate alter. Again, because in your production environment, you don't want to accidentally delete your data. Now, the very last thing that we need to do, is create a new file in our root directory for the project called procfile. Procfile. Now, what the procfile does is tells Heroku what to run to start the application. Now, it's been working fine, and it would probably continue to work fine, but just to be sure and just to be safe, we're going to add this procfile. And what this procfile does is that we're going to type web:/sales lift. And what this file does, when you push it up, and after it installs the node modules, once we push our code and it installs the node modules, this tells Heroku what command to run to start my application. Now, it's been running at a command called just node app.js. But if we want to run something special, in this case we do because sales is special, we're going to run sales lift. And this web:/sales lift in our procfile, in our root directory, tells Heroku to do that. So now we'll commit our changes, including that change to the production environment that we hadn't set yet. Finish configuring production. Commit our changes, hop back over once again, git push Heroku master. This pushes the last changes to our application, including, you'll notice as the runtime environment, node env equals production. Like I said, that is the default environment for a new node application. So as this pushes, as it goes up, it's going to push all the code. And if we go real quick and open up the logs, we can see the build succeeded and we're good to go. And then we can open up our application. We can hop on over to our application, refresh the page, make sure things are still up and running. Again, remember, if at any time you have problems, the best place to check is that Heroku logs --tail command to see if there's any problems in your build, and you can look for error messages there, and they're usually extremely helpful in figuring out what might have gone wrong. And now we have our application, and you can share that URL with anybody in the world, and anybody in the world can get in and edit your database. So feel free to check it out while it's up. I'll probably take mine down sometime soon. But for now, there it is, and you can go ahead and edit all the code you want.